Hi, everyone, and welcome to this new Trisotech webinar. Today's topic is deployment, performance, agility, and flexibility using the Trisotech Digital Distributed Container. So if I wanted to translate that, we're going to talk about mostly DevOps and containers and how we can take a model from our modeling environment all the way to our automation environment and deploy it as a container. So my name is Simon. I'm the R&D lead here at Trisotech. And with me today, we have Magic, our R&D lead. Hi, Magic.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Everything's good, thank you.
You sure? Because we have some technical problem today.
yes.
So
but, let's move on without that.
yeah. So we'll be able to do most of the technical presentation, but we have some problem. We're trying on a new platform, and we have some little issues here and there, but we'll get through it. So before we get started, of course, this is live, so we will answer some questions at the end of the webinar, so you can type them in the YouTube chat, and we will be able to answer them later. So let's get started on the digital distributed containers. Trisotech has adopted the container technology a while ago, and basically we think it's the best way for our clients to deploy services in their environment. It offers scalability, redundancy, everything you want for a production system. So the digital distributed container allows to package service build in our modeling suite as container images. And once you have those container images, you can run them mostly everywhere. And the services we create with our modeling suite can be deployed as images, and those images can also be either hosted on the digital enterprise suite or through an external container registry. And we will look at the details of that in this presentation. So let me flip that. Magic, maybe you want to talk to us a little bit about the, let's say, basic pipeline, DevOps pipeline from modeling to automation, and then how, when you use digital distributed container, this changes a little bit.
All right, definitely. So the basic use case, the development workflow with digital enterprise suite is that you as a user start with the business logic modeling, like decisions, processing, and cases. Once you are sort of ready to start automating those, you can publish or deploy those models, and they become services, but they are deployed on the digital enterprise suite instance as well. So they kind of co-located with the where you model them. And as soon as you have those deployed, you can interact with them through the service library and then the interfaces of the service, and that can be easily shared with the end users. And as an additional step, you can then promote this service again within the same the digital enterprise suite instance between different environments. So that's like the basic flow.
Yeah, so that would be if you're not using digital distributed container, you always stay on the Trisotech platform, but you can still have a Trisotech enabled kind of DevOps platform when you can go from a test environment to a production environment. But this is staying into the Trisotech platform. Now,
exactly.
if we look at how the digital distributed distributed container enable to go outside of the Trisotech platform with your DevOps platform, if you want to explain to us the details.
The starting point is pretty much the same. So you as a user model your business logic, you prepare everything that you need to automate, and then you deploy it. And at the deployment time, it is still available for you to try it out locally as part of the digital enterprise suite instance. But at the same time, the container image is built. So this is where we kind of expand from the basic workflow into more DevOps-oriented one, where we can integrate with other practices of the DevOps as well. So in this particular situation, we can actually trigger a CI/CD pipeline for that container that was just built. And then it's really up to you what you define within the CI/CD pipeline. It could be as simple as deployment to a particular environment. It could be to scan the image, even though we do scan our images as well. So they are secure by default, but you might have a different set of metrics that you wanted to capture during those executions. And then again, you control the pipeline, so you can then expand to whatever practices you have in your organization, because that should not differ from your, let's say, custom built services as well. And in the end, once you deploy that to a production environment, this is where the end users start interacting with those services.
Yeah. So basically, it's the same DevOps pipeline until we reach the service library. And then from the service library, we can go as a container and then take over, or the client can take over the DevOps pipeline and get it can be triggered. And we're going to show that later as well, how we can use the emitters to trigger those workflow. Oops, I skipped one slide. Maybe it's worth mentioning at this point that we offer two flavors of digital distributed containers, the single service container and the multi-service container. And let's say the obvious difference between the two flavors is that in a single service container, wait for it, there's only one service and one version of it. But in the multi-service container, there can be multiple versions of the same service and multiple services as well included in there. And it is basically the two models are slightly different, but in general, the same. It is taking either one or multiple service and containerizing them. And depending on if you pray a little bit more to the church of the microservice, one service, one container, or if you're more on the side of let's cut the costs a little bit and bundle a bunch of services together to save on computing power and resources, then you can decide a little bit your strategy based on that. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can decide which way to go. But basically, whether you go with single service container where all of your container would be a single service, or the multi-service container where they would have multiple service into one, they work mostly in the same manner. There's a slight difference on how you build them. The single service container are built automatically when you deploy a new service from the modeling, and the multi-service container are built from the service library where you just select the different services you want. And regardless if you want a deeper integration with your DevOps, both offer an API to trigger the build of the container images. And that's about it for the difference between the two.
Yeah, one thing that is worth mentioning around that is that, as you mentioned, there are multiple services included in the particular container. But what is important to note is that it might be multiple distinct services, or might be multiple versions of the same service. So this is actually enabling you, especially for things like processing and cases where the state of it is persisted, that you can have kind of a continuation use case, that you bundled all versions of a particular service within the same container, and they ship as a complete set of features, so to say.
Yeah, absolutely. So at deployment, once we have those containers, what can we do with them?
Yeah, so exactly. So that's the next step. Once we know what the containers are and what types we have of them. So containers can actually run on literally any container runtime available. So the de facto standard these days is the Kubernetes as the container orchestration platform, and the digital distributed containers play very well with Kubernetes. So just to give you one example, as part of the service library, you can easily find a template that gives you the access to a set of Kubernetes resources that allows you to easily deploy that to the Kubernetes cluster. But don't treat that as a production-ready setup. It's more of a starting point where you start looking at different options and different types of characteristics at runtime that you need to put when deploying your containers.
Well, you say not production-ready, but basically, we also offer the administrator to change a template. Yeah. We kind of give a vanilla template that is like, hey, this will get you started, but the administrator of the Digital Enterprise Suite can also tailor this template to be production ready for your environment.
Yeah, it definitely can be changed to be production ready. Exactly. So my point was just that, we start with that, and then you can expand depending on what you have in your environment and what you would like to have it. So additional thing that you need to take into account when it comes to the deployment is the type of services. So we classify them as either stateless services, which are usually backed by decisions, because then you don't need to persist the state of the invocation and so on. But for the stateful services, which are based on processes and cases, in most of the cases, they will have some sort of state to persist across the invocation because they are considered long running. And here, those decisions and those types of services will actually drive the sort of complexity of the deployment. So that needs to be taken into account as well.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about agility. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
I can definitely take it. So with the introduction of the DevOps practices, which is nothing new these days, but what we definitely learned is that the automation is definitely a key to the efficiency of the delivery of the software, to be both correct and secure. But at the same time, being able to integrate smoothly with those practices enables a lot of additional use cases. And I'm talking mainly here about the CI and CD pipelines, or the continuous deployment, continuous delivery. And Digital Enterprise Suite is actually coming with something that you might hear on the previous webinars, something called event emitters. That is actually an internal mechanism that reacts to things happening within the platform and can react and call an external system as well. And for this particular scenario, we're going to use the event emitters as a webhooks that allows us to trigger the CI and CD pipelines. So those can be integration with different vendors like the GitLab or GitHub and those, or similar to those, that you actually own and you control how it actually integrates with your organization's environment. So with the event emitters, we will be able to simply use the webhooks to call the pipeline that will be responsible for performing the operations on top of the decisions that you made defining those pipelines. Yep, we can move on to the next one.
Bit, too eager on the next slide, sorry.
Yeah.
So if we talk about flexibility at the deployment, when working with digital distributed container, there's a lot of flexibility around the way that the images are built. So we can either host the container image on the Trisotech platform. So the Trisotech platform would act as a container registry in that case, or we can push to external registries as well, so that you have full control over your images. We can create container images as well using service libraries, selecting the different services we want. We can use our fully featured REST API to create the containers, so you can also automate from a DevOps point of view that part. And I already mentioned that we can either host them or push them. And we mostly already said what's in there. So let's talk a little bit about performance and how can we evaluate the performance of those digital distributed container. Magic, if you want to take it over.
Yep. So again, performance is kind of a tricky thing because it's not we cannot give you a silver bullet or single answer to how the performance will be.
It's model dependent.
Exactly. It's all based on the model. It's based on the characteristics of your runtime environment, and if you use status or stateful services. So it's really important to sort of think about what is behind the service that you're going to deploy, because it's not just that you model it, but you need to understand what are the consequences at runtime when it comes to configuration. So it usually comes down to asking yourself a number of questions, and we just outline here a few of them. So if you need to have any dynamic scaling or the auto scaling, if you need how many automation transactions you're going to have per day, is that hundreds, thousands, millions, because it all will drive on the decisions around the infrastructure to actually provide the service with enough resources to be performant. And at the same time, when it goes to geographical distribution of your service, this might be a valid question as well for number of services that you might be willing to deploy. And as Simon already mentioned, the preference according to when you wanted to stick to a microservice setup where you have one service per container, you would like to go for more of a sort of bundled service approach where you can include either multiple versions or multiple services in the same container. Again, all depends on the requirements and your needs, right? So this is really what you need to keep in mind and sort of find those answers to those questions to be able to find the right characteristics to be able to meet the expectations of the runtime.
Right. Hey, we're done with slides mostly, so let's go to a demo. All right, so as I mentioned, we have a little bit of a technical issue on the sharing. So I will be doing the demo, but you were supposed to do it. So please guide me through it.
Yeah,
and so
definitely.
The first thing we want to show is, yeah, go ahead.
So quickly, a quick introduction what the demo is about. So what we wanted to show is that we are not going to look at the modeling part. So we have 3 services already modeled, 1 decision and 2 process-based. So we wanted to sort of start from there and create a container for those services. So we are going to look at the multi-service containers. So just go ahead, Simon, select 3 of them.
Okay, and we're going to select them all.
Yep, select all. And we build a container
from that.
Correct. Right. And you should have already the name, the image ref.
I got it. And I'm going to use your identity because we shared it before. So, hey.
Exactly. So what happens here, you can already press the button because it will take a little bit of time. So what we are going to do is build a container and push it to Azure Container Registry. As you could see that Simon selected the identity. So we need to authenticate ourselves towards that. And we push the image. So once we have that, the container image, as you can see, is already built and pushed. We have the container. So now it's the sort of integration, as we mentioned as part of the presentation, that we want to have that integrated with the CI and CD pipeline. So with that, we can quickly jump into the emitters as well, Simon, in the Digital Enterprise Suite. So we can look at how we can actually define that. So you go to the settings, you have the event emitters there. And there we have a GitLab deployer. So that's just a webhook integration. The only thing we can look at the emitter configuration because that's the most relevant part. Exactly. So you can see the URL. So this is the GitHub API URL that allows us to trigger that pipeline. We use the identity.
And you also put your credentials there.
Exactly. And then one thing that might be worth to mention is the filter. So this allows us to sort of filter events for the containers that are being built, because right now what we want to react to is that we want to only trigger this pipeline for containers that were built for environment called no triggers. And only containers that were built for that environment will trigger this pipeline.
You kind of chose a not that great name for your environment, but typically they would be called test, production, development, or something like that. But
you know that the naming is always the most difficult.
Not that I'm complaining, just basically you can name that whatever you want. So we can see here that you're hooked into the container messages, and basically on the container publish, it's going to trigger the GitLab pipeline. So we just chose GitLab because internally at Trisotech we use GitLab, but that could be anything, right? That would be triggered.
Correct, exactly. So it can trigger pretty much anything. If you go to the CI and CD pipeline, we should already see the pipeline is either running or it's already completed.
Yeah,
as you can see, it was 1 minute ago. Exactly. So what this pipeline does is just simply connecting to Azure Kubernetes service and deploying the container. So that has...
Can I click on this so there's no secret in it? So
no, secrets are secrets, so they are hidden.
No, but I just want to make sure that I'm not showing anything that's terrible on the screen.
No, so you can see here is the deployment.
That's the commit that you did, sorry.
If you go to repository and files, you can see there we have just the definition of the pipeline, which is the single file.
Yeah,
and the other one is the configuration of the YAML file that we're actually deploying to the Kubernetes. That's essentially it. So there is nothing really specific. Yeah, if you go to the deploy one, so this is just the Kubernetes that was actually taken from the DES, from the service library. And you can see there are a bunch of resources, Kubernetes resources, that allows us to interact with the Kubernetes cluster and just deploy that and make it running.
And probably something interesting that we need to say for the demo a little bit later is the autoscaler, or that part I'm not sure we're going to be able to show because I don't have that on my computer, right?
No, we won't be able to show the autoscaler right now, but at least, what is right now, it's that it's actually deployed. We can see that in the Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah.
And we have that exposed at the public URL as well. So I just paste you the link to the service library, so you can actually show it as well. So right now, this actually showed you how you can very quickly go from the services that you built in Digital Enterprise Suite, integrate that with the CI and CD pipeline of your choice, which you control and you maintain. And at the end, you will see that it's actually running in a Kubernetes cluster exposed to your end users, depending if it's the internal audience that you want to run your system test or the user acceptance test, or it's already production environment that the end users will going to consume those services there. And as you can see, you have exact same services that you selected. Those services are already there available. And as Simon mentioned, we were planning to show the auto-scaling, which we just simply put load on the service, and they will start scaling within the Kubernetes cluster to have multiple replicas to handle the incoming load. So that is, again, part of the deployment pipeline, because it's the resources that you define. And you define how quickly it should scale up and scale down.
So basically, if we want to do a little bit of recap of what we did, so we had models in our Trisotech service library. So we selected them, or sorry, I said models, but services, and we automatically created a container image. We pushed it to Azure. That triggered a GitLab pipeline that took that new image and deployed it automatically onto a Kubernetes cluster. So that's a simplified way of doing that. You could also play with different ingress settings so that you can have them all deployed in parallel and things like that with different ingress. So there's a lot of things that can be done there.
Yeah.
I guess, what else did you want to show? Do you want to?
No, that's pretty much all for this demonstration, because that was mainly focusing on integration with the CI and CD environmental pipelines.
So what really was missing is we had planned a little bit show and tell on let's load that service and it's going to scale to a few pods under load and then come back. But let's say it happened and you just didn't see it. All right. So another thing we wanted to discuss is the promotion of container across environments, right?
Correct. So that's one of the things that might not be very visible at first, because you're developing your services. If you need to interact with the external systems, like let's say calling a public APIs or connecting to message brokers to either consume or produce messages. Because in DS, you can simply, as part of the modeling, you define your interfaces that you talk to the external system with, and those come with a location of the service or the credentials that you need to use to actually authenticate yourselves while connecting. So since we wanted to follow the best practices and principles of the containers, meaning that they should be immutable, we don't want to rebuild the container because we're changing the location of a particular message broker or a public API, or we need to change the credentials and so on and so forth. Because again, what we want to do is that we will have a guarantee that what we tested and what we run in production is the same thing. If we would rebuild that guarantee is kind of lost. So with the upcoming release, we will have additional features that allows you to, first of all, work with those things, such as information about the credentials or the location of the services in sort of externalized way. That will be able to
probably show that with inline here if I want to promote one of those services. Which one had dependency to
the service calls?
Service calls, this one? Yeah. Okay, so if I want to promote this one here, it's gonna basically tell me that it is connecting on that URL based on an OAuth 2, and I can come here and modify this to use a different identity, for instance. So
exactly. So if you change, for instance, the server URL, that will tell you, okay, now you're going to interact with something that is on a different location, and you need to provide the credentials for that location. And you can take advantage of what we already have in Digital Enterprise Suite, which is the identity management. So you can then have things securely stored there and then reused, or if it's still missing, then you can create new identity. And if in case that you don't have anything to authenticate, you can set it to none as well, and that will go without authentication towards a particular environment.
I'm not going to create new identities for you.
No, we don't need to do that right now, because
yeah.
The whole point of saying this is that it allows you to interact with your containers in an immutable way, that you constantly promote the same container and just supply a different configuration at runtime or at deploy time.
So basically, if we looked at the model here, those two services were connected to the same interface or the same server because they were two decision service. So basically, we could change those at the same time to make it easy as well.
Yeah.
All right. But what we're saying is that this is also possible once you've built a container. We can always edit those and then save them as Kubernetes secrets. That will be available in our next release under settings here and under the service descriptor editor here, where you're going to be able to extract a service descriptor from a container, just paste it here, and from here modify the URLs and or credentials for them. And after that, export that as a Kubernetes secret or an environment variable that will be
and that Kubernetes secret becomes another resource that is part of your deployment pipeline. So that could be exactly as we did presented today, that you can easily integrate that again as part of the deployment pipeline, that it just grabs the new version for the, for instance, production environment and deploy that together with the updated Kubernetes secret.
Makes sense. So I guess we're at the wrap-up time. I don't have any question yet, so we're running a little bit long, but please ask questions if you want. It's time now while you maybe wrap up a little bit what we said today.
All right, so the presentation topic was to show digital distributed containers as scalable, flexible, and agile services. So we hope that that kind of gave you the enough information to look at them as something that you can expand, especially for you who use the Digital Enterprise Suite as the runtime environment. This could be taking it to the next level and sort of integrating that with the your organization DevOps practices as well. So we talked about the digital distributed containers, that they come with two flavors, the multi and single service containers, being able to use those containers on Kubernetes platform or the container orchestration platform to be able to easily scale up and dynamically adapt to the load. Integration with the DevOps practices, with the CI and CD capabilities and pipelines through the event emitters and the webhook invocations, and being able to stick to the principles of the immutability of the containers to be able to secure and guarantee the correctness of the deployments we do across different environments. So with that, I think we are ready to open up for questions if someone had any.
Yeah, I don't have any question yet, so maybe we can open like just a tiny bit, a little side door about the persistence of long-running instances. And that's a question we often get with deployments because like for straight-through processing, it is easy, whether it's a decision model or a process model that doesn't stop in the middle, but like kind of run all in one shot without requiring to be persisted. There's no problem with as long as we have long-running processes or long-running services, then it becomes some kind of a challenge with the storage. And with digital distributed container, we want them to be scalable, not only in one Kubernetes cluster, but also across different clusters as well. So you could distribute your load geographically as well with a load balancer in front of it that would balance between, let's say, region, things like that. And so could you talk a little bit, let's kind of keep it up to a 2-minute discussion on how we tackle those problems.
Yeah, so what we have is that the digital distributed containers come with two types or two mechanisms to persist data. One is based on the file system, and that's the default one. So that's sort of when we talk about containers and the Kubernetes, that relies heavily on the volumes to be mounted. And that obviously can scale to certain limits, but it's not something that, as you said, that can work across Kubernetes clusters, right? So that's definitely not something that you would go for. But the other mechanism, which is more for much bigger distribution, much bigger scalability option, is based on MongoDB as the document database. And that allows you to have both within single cluster, across cluster, across geographical location, where we can easily scale and even shard the information across those Kubernetes clusters or the different instances of the database to make sure that the data is as close as your to your end users as possible. So that's exactly what we wanted to rely on. But again, it's just very quick introduction to what we have there.
Yeah. So we have one question that came in while you were answering my planted question or my side door discussion, was that are all of these features available now? So everything we've presented is available, but for one thing. So the ability to change a container dependencies on an external service, whether it's the URL of that service or the identity of that service, is not yet available on our production systems. We're currently finishing up on the testing of these, and we're planning to release that early January. So it will be available, but the digital distributed container had been in production for a while and are available today. All right, I guess we are a little bit over time, so thank you everyone for attending this session. Thank you, Magic.
Thank you.
And we'll see you on the next one.
All right, thank you very much.